May 5, 1945. Hitler has been dead for 5 days. German surrender will happen in 2 days. The war, for all practical purposes, is over. But in a medieval castle perched high in the Austrian Alps, the strangest battle of World War II is about to begin. A battle where American soldiers will fight alongside their German enemies. What you're about to discover is not fiction. It is the only documented moment in all of World War II when American and German troops stood together, not because of political deals, not because of strategic advantage, but for something rarer than either, because doing the right thing mattered more than following orders. This is the story of the Battle of Castle Itter. And to understand how mortal enemies became unlikely allies, you first need to understand what awaited them in that isolated castle in the mountains. Castle Itter sits at 800 meters elevation in northern Tyrol, Austria. A medieval fortress with 700-year-old stone walls, surrounded by snow-covered alpine peaks and deep valleys where the echo of a gunshot can reverberate for miles. During most of the war, this castle served a dark purpose. It was a Nazi political prison designed to keep high-value French VIPs out of the spotlight, yet alive enough to be used as bargaining chips if Germany needed to negotiate. Édouard Daladier, former Prime Minister of France, was held there. Paul Reynaud, who had also held that same office, shared his confinement. General Maxime Weygand, a legendary military figure who had commanded French forces, was among the prisoners. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were political and military leaders whose capture represented propaganda trophies for the Third Reich. But in May 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling. Hitler had shot himself in the Berlin bunker on April 30th. Allied forces were advancing from all sides. The Nazi war machine, once thought unstoppable, now fragmented into pockets of fanatical resistance and mass desertion. And it was in this terminal chaos that a sinister order arrived at Castle Itter. The Waffen-SS, the most ideologically committed military division of the Nazi regime, received clear instructions: eliminate the French prisoners before the Allies could free them. There could be no witnesses. There could be no victory trophies for the liberators. If the Reich was doomed, it would take its secrets and its captives to the grave. That was when one man made a decision that would change everything. Major Josef Gangl, 43 years old, was a career officer of the Wehrmacht. He was a soldier first, a professional, not an ideologue. While the SS clung to Nazi fanaticism, many Wehrmacht officers like Gangl saw the war as a military obligation, nothing more. And on that day, his obligation shifted to something else entirely. When Gangl received information about the order to execute the French prisoners at Castle Itter, he found himself facing an inescapable moral choice. He could follow orders, allow innocent men to be slaughtered in the final moments of an already lost war. Or he could do something no German soldier had done publicly during the entire war: openly desert and seek an alliance with the enemy to prevent a crime. Gangl chose humanity. He gathered 10 Wehrmacht soldiers who thought as he did, men unwilling to stain their hands with innocent blood in the final seconds of a conflict that was already decided. Together they deserted their positions and set out toward American-controlled territory. The objective was simple, but unprecedented: ask the enemy for help defending civilians against their own forces. 35 kilometers away, Captain Jack Lee Jr. of the 23rd Tank Battalion of the American 12th Armored Division was consolidating control over newly captured territory when he received a message he never expected to hear. A German officer was asking to speak with him, not to surrender, but to propose a joint military alliance. Lee was 26 years old and had seen enough combat to distrust any German approach. But when Gangl explained the situation, something rare happened in the mind of a war-hardened field commander. He recognized the desperate sincerity of a man trying to save innocent lives. The French prisoners at Castle Itter were high-value political civilians. The SS was sending troops from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division to execute them, and time was running out. Lee did the math quickly. He had 14 American soldiers available and 2 Sherman tanks. Gangl brought 10 Wehrmacht soldiers. That totaled 24 fighters against an estimated force of 100 to 150 elite Waffen-SS troops equipped with anti-aircraft weapons adapted for ground use. The odds were roughly 5 to 1 against them. In purely military terms, it was a suicide mission. But Lee saw something beyond tactics. He saw the opportunity for one final act of humanity in a war of monsters. He accepted the alliance. For the first time in all of World War II, American and German soldiers would prepare to fight side by side. There was no field manual for this. There was no historical precedent, only a shared understanding that some things transcend uniforms and flags. The combined force departed immediately. Sherman tanks roared up the mountain, American and German soldiers in the same column. Mortal enemies the week before now planned overlapping fields of fire and coordinated defensive positions. When they arrived at the castle, they found the French prisoners in a state of nervous alert. Daladier, Renaud, and Weygand had heard rumors about the execution order. Now, they stared in disbelief at their unlikely liberators, a handful of Americans and Germans who had decided they were worth defending. Lee and Gangel immediately began assessing the tactical situation. Itter Castle was not a modern military fortress, but its medieval stone walls were over a meter thick. The narrow windows, originally designed for archers, would now serve as rifle embrasures. The main gate was the most vulnerable point, a narrow entrance that would funnel any attacking force into a natural killing zone. But there was a critical problem: limited ammunition. Lee had set out on a reconnaissance mission, not for a prolonged siege. Every shot would have to count. And with a 5-to-1 ratio against them, there would be no margin for waste. The following hours were devoted to fortifying the castle. The Sherman tanks were positioned to cover the main approaches. American and German soldiers occupied positions in the windows and walls, distributed to maximize fields of fire. Gangel took on the role of coordinating interior positions, using his knowledge of the local terrain. Lee commanded the overall defensive strategy, applying American tactical doctrine adapted to medieval architecture. And then, on the distant horizon, the dust began to rise. Vehicles were approaching. The Waffen-SS was coming. What Lee and Gangel could not know at that moment was how many enemies they would actually face. Estimates varied between 100 and 150 highly trained combatants of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, a unit known for its ferocity and fanatical loyalty to the Reich, even as everything crumbled around it. These were not soldiers ready to surrender. They were ideologues willing to fight to the death, convinced that executing the French prisoners was their final duty to a regime that no longer existed. The tension in the castle was palpable. American soldiers checked and double-checked their weapons. German soldiers did the same, many still processing the strangeness of the situation they found themselves in. The French prisoners were instructed to remain in the castle's more protected interior areas, away from windows and outer walls. Lee gathered his men, Americans and Germans, together and spoke with brutal clarity. They were outnumbered, with limited ammunition, defending a medieval castle against a determined modern force, intent on leaving no one alive. The odds of survival were not good, but there was something at stake greater than their individual lives. There were principles. There was the refusal to allow the war's final acts to be meaningless executions. Gangel reinforced the point in German for his own soldiers. They had deserted not out of cowardice, but out of courage. They had chosen to stand on the right side of history when it still mattered, and now they would defend that choice with their lives, if necessary. The sound of engines grew louder. The SS troops were positioning themselves around the castle, establishing their own lines of attack. There was a strange pause, a tense silence as both sides prepared. It was as if time itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when soldiers who should have been enemies fought as brothers. In the early hours of the morning of May 5th, the silence around Itter Castle was almost unreal, the kind of silence that precedes not peace, but violence. Lee and Gangel knew it wouldn't last long. They had positioned their forces with the care of surgeons operating on a patient on the brink of death. Each American and German soldier had a designated sector, an assigned field of fire, a clear responsibility. But knowing what to do and actually doing it when bullets start flying are two completely different things. The defense concentrated on the main entrance, a single stone bridge over a dry moat. Any attacking force would have to cross it exposed, under the aim of rifles in narrow windows. It was a perfect, deadly funnel about to be tested against modern weapons. Lee had positioned his Sherman tank at the entrance of the main gate, positioned so its gun could cover the bridge and the access road. The second tank was in the inner courtyard, ready to pivot and cover any sector that needed heavy fire support. It was a clever configuration, using modern machines of war in an ancient stone structure. But Lee knew these tanks were targets. The SS had anti-tank weapons. Once they identified the tanks' positions, the battle would change quickly. Gangel organized his own men with the efficiency of someone who had fought on multiple fronts for years. He knew SS tactics better than the Americans. They would not come in a single massive wave. They would probe, test defenses, look for weak points. Then, when they found a breach, they would concentrate massive fire and attempt to break through. The key was not to give them that breach. The language barrier was real, but workable. Point to a sector. Hold up 3 fingers, everyone understands. Touch a rifle. Point to a window that's universal. But more importantly, there was something deeper connecting them. None of them were fighting for territory or because of some order on a piece of paper. They were fighting because staying silent while prisoners were executed would have made them complicit. That shared conviction spoke louder than any translation ever could. The French prisoners, men who had commanded armies and governed nations, were now sheltered within the castle walls. Édouard Daladier, who had been Prime Minister of France, sat in silence. Paul Reynaud, another former Prime Minister, gazed out the window with the expression of a man who had watched European civilization crumble, and now was witnessing its strangest final chapter. General Maxime Weygand, a renowned military commander, understood exactly what Lee and Gangel were trying to do. He knew the odds. He knew that good men were about to die for him. And then the silence shattered. The first shot did not come from a rifle. It came from an 88mm anti-aircraft gun that the SS had positioned on a hill overlooking the castle. The projectile struck the outer wall with an explosion that shook loose stones from the parapets. It was a ranging shot, intended to test the defenders' response and reveal their positions. Lee ordered his men to hold their fire. There was no point in wasting ammunition or revealing gun positions for a single round. The second shot hit closer to the gate. The third struck Lee's Sherman tank, but ricocheted off the sloped armor without penetrating. It was a warning. The SS was saying, "We know where you are. We can reach you. This is just the beginning." Then the infantry waves began. The SS soldiers emerged from the tree line in groups of 6 to 8 men, moving in covered and movement patterns. They were professionals, trained and disciplined. They did not charge directly at the castle like fanatics. They advanced tactically, using every depression in the terrain, every stone, every tree as cover. And there were many of them. From Lee's observation point atop the gatehouse tower, he could see at least 50 SS soldiers moving toward the castle from multiple directions. And that was just the first wave. Gangel gave the order in German. Lee gave the order in English. Both said the same thing. Hold your fire until they are 100 meters out. Holding your fire while armed men advance toward you tests every nerve you have. Everything in you wants to open up, to do something, anything, instead of standing there watching the threat get closer. But every shot reveals your position. Every shot wasted is ammunition you won't have later. Lee and Gangel both knew this. Their men knew it too. So they waited, controlling their breathing, fingers on triggers, refusing to fire until the moment mattered. 75 meters, 50 meters, 40 meters. Lee raised his hand. Gangel did the same. Then both lowered them. The castle erupted in fire. M1 Garand rifles fired from second-floor windows. German machine guns opened fire from positions in the towers. The Sherman tank's cannon roared, sending a high-explosive round directly into a group of SS soldiers using a large boulder as cover. The explosion turned the cover into shrapnel, and the men behind it into casualties. In the first 30 seconds of coordinated fire, the first SS wave was devastated. Men fell. Others retreated toward the tree line. Some lay trapped in open ground, pressed against the earth as bullets ricocheted off the stones around them. It was the kind of ambush that only works when defenders have the advantage of terrain and the discipline to wait for the right moment. But the SS did not retreat. They regrouped. The second wave came 15 minutes later, this time from a different angle. They had learned from the first attempt. Instead of advancing directly, they used smoke to cover their movement. Smoke grenades exploded near the bridge, creating a gray cloud that obscured the defenders' line of sight. Under the cover of smoke, the SS soldiers moved closer. Lee shouted orders to his tank gunner. The Sherman fired 3 quick rounds into the smoke, aiming at where Lee thought the enemy infantry was concentrating. The explosions cleared the smoke temporarily, revealing bodies and wounded men. But they also revealed how many more were still coming. Gangel had positioned 2 of his own men in a side tower with a clear view of the flank. When the SS soldiers tried to move around the smoke screen, those 2 German soldiers caught them with flanking fire. It was precision shooting, not panicked bursts. Every shot was purposeful. Every shot counted, because ammunition was not infinite. Here's the brutal math they both understood. Every attack they repelled bought time, but time was a luxury they couldn't afford. Each wave meant fewer bullets in their guns. The SS had supplies. The SS had reserves. The defenders had what they brought to the gate, and that was running out. The question wasn't whether they'd run out of ammunition. The question was how much longer they could hold once they did. The third wave struck an hour later. This time, the SS brought heavy weapons. The 88mm anti-aircraft gun began firing directly into the castle's structure, not to penetrate the walls, but to break loose stones and create shrapnel. Pieces of medieval stone became projectiles, flying through the internal corridors and wounding men who weren't even near a window. One of the American soldiers, a 19-year-old from Tennessee, was struck in the head by a piece of stone the size of a fist. He fell unconscious. Gangel ran to him, checked his pulse, and dragged him away from the window. The soldier was alive, but out of the fight. 24 defenders had become 23. And then Lee's Sherman tank took a direct hit. The projectile didn't penetrate the frontal armor, but it struck the left track, breaking it and immobilizing the tank. The Sherman could still rotate its turret and fire, but it couldn't move. It was now a stationary bunker, a fixed target. Lee knew what that meant. The SS now knew exactly where the tank was, and that it couldn't move. They would concentrate fire on it until they destroyed it or forced it to retreat to the inner courtyard, where it would be useless for defending the bridge. Lee made the decision in seconds. He would keep the tank at the gate position as long as possible. Every minute that passed was another minute the French prisoners stayed alive. Another minute the war moved closer to its end. Another minute that mattered. Gangel moved from position to position like a ghost, checking on his men, adjusting sight lines, stretching ammunition. He'd been in this war since the beginning, seen cities leveled, watched armies collapse, followed orders that turned his stomach. But this was different. This battle had weight. It meant something. He was fighting to keep innocent people alive. Fighting next to men he was supposed to hate because they turned out to share his conscience. And he was doing it because he'd decided to. He didn't know that decision would kill him before nightfall. The fourth wave came at midday. The SS had brought mortars. Shells began falling into the castle's inner courtyard, targeting the second tank and the interior defensive positions. The explosions were deafening in the confined space. Shrapnel ricocheted off the stone walls, creating a storm of metal within the very castle that was supposed to protect them. One of Gangel's German soldiers was hit in the chest by shrapnel. He fell, bleeding heavily. 2 of his comrades dragged him inside while covering fire continued from the windows above. Gangel ran down to check on the man. The wound was severe. Without a hospital, without proper medical equipment, the soldier wouldn't survive. But they had neither hospital nor equipment. They had stone walls and the will to fight. Lee climbed to the castle's highest observation point, surveying the tactical situation. What he saw was not encouraging. The SS had established positions in a semicircle around the castle, covering all approach roads. They were firing mortars from safe positions several hundred meters away. They were in no hurry. They were wearing down the defenders, consuming their ammunition, breaking their will. And it was working. Lee checked his ammunition. Less than half of what they'd started with. The Sherman tank had fired most of its high-explosive rounds. The machine guns were running low on ammunition belts. The rifles still had ammunition, but not enough for another full day of combat. And no one knew when, or if, reinforcements would arrive. Gangel climbed to the observation point, joining Lee. For a moment, the 2 men simply stood there, looking out at the battlefield. They needed no common language to understand what both were thinking. They were running out of time. It was Lee who broke the silence. He pointed to the SS mortar position and then to the damaged tank below. He gestured a question. Can the tank hit that position? Gangel studied the angle, calculated the distance, and nodded. It could, but it would require exposing the tank's turret fully, making it vulnerable to direct anti-tank fire. Lee nodded. Do it." The Sherman's gunner adjusted his aim, elevating the gun to its maximum angle. The tank fired. The shell flew over the trees and struck near the SS mortar position. It wasn't a direct hit, but it was close enough. The mortar crew retreated, seeking cover. The bombardment stopped temporarily. But the pause came at a cost. The SS anti-tank gun, now with a clear line of sight to the exposed tank turret, fired. The projectile struck the Sherman's turret, not penetrating completely, but causing enough damage to jam the turret rotation. The tank now could neither turn nor move. It was a metal hulk, useless as a weapon, but still blocking the gate. Lee shouted for his tank crew to evacuate. They scrambled out through the hatch, running for the shelter of the castle while SS bullets rained around them. They all made it, but the tank was lost. The count of defenders was dwindling, one seriously wounded, one tank destroyed, critical ammunition, and the SS still had more than 100 men, heavy weapons, and no hurry. Inside, Paul Reynaud watched from a window. He turned to Weygand, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a man who'd already watched his country collapse. "They're going to die for us," Reynaud said. Weygand had no answer. There was no answer to give. It was the simple, unbearable truth. Gangel had taken on a role that went beyond commander. He was everywhere, patching up defenses, reallocating men, conserving ammunition. But more than that, he had become the human shield for the French prisoners. Whenever a sector near where they were sheltered came under heavy fire, Gangel was there, placing himself between the bullets and the civilians. Not because he was ordered to, because it was who he was. Lee saw it, and he understood the difference between Gangel and 1,000 other soldiers he'd known. Gangel wasn't fighting to win, he was fighting to protect. Those aren't the same thing. A soldier fighting to win looks for an exit when the numbers turn against him. A soldier fighting to protect? He stays. He holds. He dies at his post if that's what it takes. The fifth wave hit in the middle of the afternoon. This time, the SS tried a different tactic. They sent a small group of soldiers not to attack, but to negotiate. An SS officer, carrying an improvised white flag, walked halfway across the bridge. He shouted in German, loud enough for Gangel to hear. The message was simple. Surrender now. Hand over the French prisoners. The war is over anyway. There is no sense in dying for nothing. Gangel walked to the edge of the parapet, fully visible, totally exposed. He looked down at the SS officer below. And then, in loud, clear German, he answered. He said, "No. Nothing more, just no." The SS officer stood there for a moment as if expecting more. But there was nothing more. Gangel had given his answer. The officer retreated to the tree line. 5 minutes later, the bombardment resumed, heavier than before. The SS message was clear. There would be no more negotiations. There would be no more pauses. They would attack until the defenders were dead or ammunition ran out, whichever came first. Lee gathered his remaining men. Dust caked his face. His voice was shot from yelling orders. But when he spoke, every word landed hard. "We hold. That's it. We hold." Gangel translated, and then he looked his own men in the eye. "We came here to make a choice," he said in German. "And we made it. Everything that happens now, we did it because we decided it mattered more than staying alive. That means something. That has to mean something." The American and German soldiers looked at each other. Some nodded. Others simply returned to their positions. There were no dramatic speeches. There was no bravado. Just men who had made a decision and would now live or die by it. Afternoon turned to night. The bombardment continued. The ammunition continued to dwindle. The wounded mounted. And through it all, the stone walls of a castle 700 years old held. But stone cannot hold forever, and neither can men. Gangel stood near a window facing the inner courtyard, watching the French prisoners sheltered below. Reynaud was sitting near a wall, his head in his hands. Daladier stared into nothing. Weygand, the general, kept a silent vigil, understanding that he was witnessing something that history books could never fully capture. And it was at that moment, while Gangel watched, that the next SS wave began to move. He could see them through the smoke and gathering dusk, regrouping for what appeared to be a massive final assault. He checked his rifle. 4 bullets left. He checked the nearest machine gun. Half a belt. He looked at Lee across the courtyard. Lee looked back. They both knew. This was it. The battle was reaching its climax. The ammunition was nearly gone. The defenders were exhausted. The SS was preparing for a final assault. And somewhere in that castle, between the stone walls and the men determined to defend them, the fate of French prisoners, American soldiers, and German deserters was about to be decided. Gangl took a deep breath. He adjusted his position for a better view of the courtyard where the prisoners were sheltered. He did not know that in the next few hours, his choice to stay in that exact place would cost him everything. But even if he had known, he would not have moved. Lee could see through the smoke hanging over the courtyard. The SS was reorganizing on the slopes beyond the castle walls, regrouping forces for a massive push. He checked his rifle. 5 bullets. He looked at the nearest soldier. The American held his weapon as if it were made of pure lead, his arms trembling with fatigue. Across the courtyard, Gangl maintained his position near the window facing where the French prisoners were sheltered. His face was covered in soot and sweat, but his eyes remained alert, constantly sweeping the terrain for threats. Daladier, the former French Prime Minister, was sitting against a stone wall, his hands covering his face. Weygand, the general, watched in silence, understanding that he was witnessing something that transcended the war itself. Reynaud remained nearby, his breathing heavy but steady. Lee had seen many battles. He had commanded men across fields of death in France, through destroyed villages in Germany. But this was different. This was not about territory. It was not about strategic victory. It was about 24 men refusing to abandon defenseless civilians, even when all military training said to retreat, even when logic said they were doomed. The SS began to move. First came the sharpshooters, slipping through the trees on the slope above the castle, looking for angles to the windows. Then came the infantrymen, advancing in tight formation, using the rocky terrain for cover. And then, like a wave breaking against stone, they attacked. The sound was deafening. Machine gun bursts ricocheted off the stone walls of the castle, splintering fragments that flew through the air like shrapnel. Grenades exploded in the courtyard, sending jets of fire and debris against the ancient ramparts. The SS was no longer testing defenses. They were trying to crush the castle through sheer violence. Lee ran to the eastern wall where the pressure was most intense. 3 American soldiers were crouched behind an improvised barricade, firing with controlled precision, every bullet counting. He dropped down beside them, aimed through the smoke, and fired. An SS soldier fell. 4 bullets left. Across the courtyard, Gangl's German soldiers held the southern flank, their weapons spitting bullets in short, disciplined bursts. They weren't fighting like defeated men. They were fighting like men who had chosen a side and refused to give ground. The battle wasn't a movie. It was chaos. It was smoke and blood and the smell of burned powder mixed with pulverized stone. It was shouts in 3 different languages. Orders screamed over the roar of gunfire, men running through rubble to reach positions that might not exist in 10 seconds. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the one functioning American tank fired. The cannon roared, the projectile tearing through the air and detonating on the slope where an SS group was forming up. The explosion hurled earth and bodies into the air. For a moment, the pressure eased. For a moment, the defenders breathed. But only for a moment. Because the SS had numbers. And time. And while the castle's defenders fought with ammunition dwindling by the second, the SS just kept coming. Lee could feel it. The tide was turning. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But steadily. Inevitably. Like water rising against a cracked dam. He looked across the courtyard to Gangl. The German major stood near the window, rifle raised, eyes scanning the terrain. Even now, even with explosions shaking the walls around him, Gangl held his position. Protecting the prisoners. Refusing to give ground. And then Lee saw it. Movement in the tree line. A glint of sunlight on metal. An SS sniper, positioned on a rocky outcropping with a clear view into the castle. The rifle was moving, sweeping across the windows, hunting for targets. And then it stopped, aimed directly at the window where the French prisoners were sheltering. Lee shouted. There was no time. The distance was too great, the smoke too thick. He couldn't shoot, couldn't run. could do nothing but shout. Gangl heard. He turned his head, followed Lee's gaze, saw the sniper. And in that second, Joseph Gangl, major of the Wehrmacht, deserter from the German army, a man who had chosen humanity over ideology, made his final choice. He moved. Not toward cover, not away from the line of fire. He moved directly in front of Paul Renault, placing his own body between the former French Prime Minister and the open window. The sniper's rifle fired. Gangl staggered. His legs gave out. He fell, striking the stone wall before sliding to the floor. Blood spread across his uniform, dark red against the faded gray of Wehrmacht fabric. Renault cried out, dropping to his knees beside him. Daladier ran, his hands pressing against the wound, trying to staunch the blood flowing between his fingers. Weygand stood frozen, his face pale. Lee crossed the courtyard in one movement, his weapon raised, searching for the sniper. There, in the tree line, he aimed, fired. 3 bullets left. The sniper toppled from the rocky formation like a sack of stones. But it didn't matter. Not for Gangl. The German major lay against the wall, his breathing shallow and ragged. His eyes were open, looking at Renault, then at Daladier, then at the other French prisoners he had spent hours defending. He tried to say something. Words came out in German, barely audible, meant only for the men kneeling over him. Then he was gone. Joseph Gangl was dead. No dramatic music, no last moment of clarity, just silence in a medieval courtyard, with men who'd been enemies 3 hours ago holding him as he died. He died doing the one thing that mattered. 3 seconds of silence, just 3. Even with the battle raging outside, even with shells falling, those 3 seconds felt like they existed outside of time. Then Lee stood, jaw locked, eyes hard. He looked at his men, then at Gangl's Germans. No words needed. Every single one of them knew what came next. There was nothing to say. They already understood. The battle wasn't over, and they weren't going to let Gangl's death be in vain. What came next wasn't rage. It wasn't desperate last stands and suicidal charges. It was something colder and more effective. Methodical, relentless violence from men who'd just watched their brother die and had nothing left to lose. Americans on the east wall, Germans holding the south, the tank pivoting, firing, reloading, firing again. Every shot had weight, every position was held, and the SS kept attacking. For another 30 minutes, the battle raged. For another 30 minutes, 23 defenders held a medieval castle against over 100 trained Waffen-SS attackers. For another 30 minutes, the impossible kept happening. And then something changed. Lee heard it first. A low, distant sound, like thunder rolling through the mountains. But it wasn't thunder. It was engines. Tank engines. Many of them. The 12th Armored Division had arrived. A reinforcement column emerged from the Valley Road. A line of Sherman tanks and troop transport vehicles climbing toward Castle Itter like a tidal wave of steel. The SS saw it too, and for the first time since the battle began, they hesitated. Because numbers don't matter when the enemy has heavy armor and you don't. Lee watched from the ramparts as the SS dissolved. No orderly withdrawal, no regrouping. They just broke, scattered into the forest like they were never there at all. The execution mission was off. The will to fight was gone. When heavy armor shows up on a mountain and you've got nothing but rifles, you take the hint and get out. The battle was over. Against 5-to-1 odds, against an army of ideological fanatics determined to execute defenseless prisoners. Against every logical probability and strategic reality, 24 men had defended a medieval castle and won. But victory had a price. When the tanks of the 12th Armored Division finally reached the castle, they found a courtyard covered in debris, walls marked by bullet holes, grenade craters, and in the corner of one of the interior rooms, covered by a blood-stained coat, the body of Joseph Gangl. The French prisoners were alive, all of them, Daladier, Renault, Weygand, all the others. They had survived because American and German soldiers had chosen to stand on the side of humanity, when it would have been easier to run. Lee stood in the courtyard as medical officers carried away the wounded, and soldiers began to assess the damage. He looked at the stone walls that had withstood centuries of history, and had now withstood one last impossible battle. He thought about Gangle, a man who'd walked away from his own army not because he was a coward, but because he was the opposite. A man who'd offered his hand to the enemy not in surrender, but in partnership. A man who'd paid for that choice with his life. And that's when Lee understood. Historians would argue for decades about why this battle mattered. But the reason was simple. 24 men chose not to become the monsters they were supposed to be. 2 days later, on May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. World War II in Europe came to an end. And amid the chaos of celebration, amid millions of stories of heroism and horror, the Battle of Castle Itter almost disappeared into the margins of history. Almost. Because what happened at that castle on May 5th was unique, not just rare, not just unlikely. Completely unique. The only documented battle in all of World War II where American and German soldiers fought side by side as allies against a common enemy. The only time in 6 years of total war, in tens of millions of dead, in thousands of battles across 3 continents, that enemies became allies on the battlefield. Austria named streets after Gangle. They put up memorials, gave him posthumous honors, but buildings and plaques can't explain what he actually did. He proved something we keep forgetting, that even when everything burns, even when the world is screaming at you to pick a side and destroy the other, you can still choose humanity. And that choice matters. Castle Itter still stands today. In the mountains of North Tyrol, Austria, its medieval stone walls carry the scars of battle. Tourists visit, historians study, but few know the complete story. The story gets lost. 24 men who should have been enemies. A German major who chose what was right over what was ordered. An American captain who looked at an impossible offer and said yes. French prisoners watching enemies become allies in front of their eyes. The strangest day of a 6-year war. And maybe that's the whole point. This story matters not because it's spectacular, but because it's proof. Proof that even when everything's pulling you toward hate, you can still pick the other way. Gangle chose it. Lee chose it. 23 other men chose it. And because they did, people lived who should have died. An alliance that had no reason to exist. Existed, and the history books got something they almost never get. A story that's too improbable to be fiction. The day enemies became something more. Want more stories like this? Stories of impossible odds, battles where intelligence outsmarted brutality, moments where a few good people changed the direction of history? You're in the right place. If this hit you, hit that like button. Drop a comment. Which part gets to you most? The initial meeting? The defense? The moment Gangle made his final choice? And subscribe. Because every week we dig into the real stories behind the battles that shaped us. Here's what matters at the end of the day. Not the weapons, not the numbers, not the countries on a map, just the choices. Always the choices.